Today, we're going to look at this macromolecule comparison sheet. The four macromolecules, as you might remember, are carbohydrates, lipids, proteins, and nucleic acids. What we're going to do here is we're going to compare just two of them and see what's the same about them and what is different about them, and then do the same thing for every possible comparison to get an understanding of which ones are the most similar and which ones are the most different. We're going to look at the elements that they're made out of, their chemical properties, as well as the monomer pieces that make them up and where they might be found in the cell. So I'm going to break this down one by one for the comparison. Let's start with carbohydrates and lipids. Carbohydrates, as you might remember, are mostly sugars, and lipids, as you might remember, are mostly fats. They are both organic molecules, so they are both going to contain carbon. Let me grab that bit there, and that's going to go right in the middle. They're also both going to contain hydrogen, because where you find carbon, you almost always find hydrogen, so that also goes in the middle. Oxygen, though, is a little bit different, because oxygen is an important part of carbohydrates, but not an important part of lipids. So I'm going to take that oxygen and put it in with the carbohydrates. The next two words are polar and nonpolar, which are things that mix into water. Hydrophilic, that would be polar things, or nonpolar things that are mostly just carbon and hydrogen, are hydrophobic and do not mix into water. So just thinking about it that way, this one's pretty easy, right? Because carbohydrates, like sugars, mix pretty well into water, so they must be polar. Whereas lipids, being fats, don't mix very well into water, so they are nonpolar. Both carbohydrates and lipids are really great in the cell if what you want is energy. Carbohydrates give you real fast energy, and lipids give you more long-burning and stored energy, but they still both work. The cell membrane is a key component of the cell that helps keep things separated. It is a structural component, and if it wasn't there, the liquid inside the cell would mesh with the liquid outside the cell. What that tells me is that it has to be generally pretty hydrophobic or nonpolar, which means it's going to go over here with the lipids. Cholesterol is a word that you might be familiar with because you think of it as a fat. And if you do, that's correct. It's always a lipid. Monosaccharide is a pretty big word, but mono part means just one, and saccharide is a word that we use for sugar. So if it is one sugar, then that means monosaccharides must be carbohydrates. And finally, our last word in this comparison is triglycerides, which is three pieces in this case connected. In the case of triglycerides, the three pieces are all fatty acids, and that also belongs in lipids. So you can get the sense of how this works. For this comparison, some things will be the same, some things will be different. So both carbon and hydrogen belong in, again, every organic molecule. So carbohydrates will definitely have carbon and hydrogen, and so will proteins, so it's going to go in the middle. If you remember what proteins are made out of, they also have little pieces called amino acids, and those contain oxygen. So in this case, oxygen also gets to go in the middle because it's in both carbohydrates and proteins. Nitrogen, however, is a little bit different because it only belongs in proteins. Carbohydrates have carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen, but not always nitrogen. The same is true for sulfur. That is generally found almost only in proteins. If you think about eggs, the smell of eggs or rotten eggs, that's sulfur. So we said before that carbohydrates are polar, and if proteins contain oxygen and nitrogen and sulfur, it seems that they also must be polar, so that goes in the middle. However, we know that proteins, because they are adaptable and can do almost everything, can also be nonpolar, so they get that in their box. Energy is an important thing for carbohydrates. Now, proteins can give you energy, but generally it's not considered to be a good idea, and if you're doing that, you're probably dying. So we're going to keep energy in the carbohydrate box. An enzyme is an example of a specific kind of protein that does a specific kind of job where it catalyzes or makes a reaction go faster. So that goes with proteins. Monosaccharides, you'll remember from the last one, are a single sugar, so a type of carbohydrate. And amino acids are the single pieces, just like monosaccharides for carbohydrates, that make up proteins, so they get to go in the protein box. All right, our last carbohydrate comparison is between carbohydrates and nucleic acids. So by this point, this should be getting pretty easy, right? We know carbohydrates have carbon. We know they have oxygen. We know they have hydrogen, because that's the meaning of carbohydrates. Do nucleic acids have all of those things? It turns out that they do, because every nucleic acid has a little bit of a sugar in it. So all three of those can go in the middle. We said before that carbohydrates do not have nitrogen. So that one definitely goes just with the nucleic acids. And nucleic acids also have an extra piece. What makes them an acid is the phosphorus. So that goes with them. Because both of them have all of those polar elements, especially oxygen, they are both polar. Only carbohydrates get used for energy, because if you are eating DNA for energy, you're doing something wrong. But the important job of nucleic acids is that they provide information, which carbohydrates don't do, because they just mix into water and become kind of a mess. Monosaccharide is still the small form or monomer of a carbohydrate. And in this case, a nucleotide is a small form or a monomer of a nucleic acid. So that was pretty easy to compare. But now we're going to switch gears and start with lipids. So lipids and proteins. They are still both organic molecules, which means that by definition, they've got to have carbon and they've got to have hydrogen. So that still gets to go in the middle. But lipids, we know, don't contain a lot of other stuff. They don't even contain large amounts of oxygen. So the elements oxygen, nitrogen, and sulfur all belong only to proteins in this case. When we look at polar and nonpolar, it's pretty easy because if you remember, lipids are oils. So they are definitely nonpolar. And if you remember, proteins can also be nonpolar. So this time that goes in the middle. It's the only place where you see that. So that can be important. However, proteins can still be polar with all those extra stuff. So that goes over there. Energy is the same as when we were comparing the carbohydrates and the proteins. You could use proteins for energy, but you shouldn't think of it as their job. Enzymes are always a form of protein, so you should always think of it that way. Now, cell membrane is an interesting one because we know from previous that lipids make up the cell membrane because they have structure and are nonpolar. It turns out that proteins, because they are also nonpolar, are an important component of the cell membrane. So when we think of the cell membrane, we want to think of it as lipids and proteins. Cholesterol is the same as before because it is a lipid. Amino acids are still only parts of proteins. And triglycerides are still an important lipid. So as you can see, the comparison gets a little different each time. Now for lipids and nucleic acids. If you think about it, these are going to be really different, but they're still both organic macromolecules. So they have to have carbon and they have to have hydrogen. But we know lipids don't contain almost any other elements, at least not in high amounts. So that means all the other ones oxygen, nitrogen, and phosphorus have to belong only to nucleic acids. We know that nucleic acids are polar, but lipids are nonpolar. You're probably not going to see nucleic acids and lipids mixed together very often. In fact, the nucleic acids are contained in the nuclear membrane, which is made of lipids. So they are hidden inside a bunch of lipids. Lipids are for energy because you can use fat for energy, but you don't want to use DNA for energy. But DNA, nucleic acids, are good for information, and lipids are not. You find nucleic acids in the nucleus. That's a new word to think about where you might find them in the cell. But you still find lipids in your cell membrane because they help to make up the cell membrane. You don't want DNA to make up your cell membrane. Your cell would definitely fall apart. Cholesterol is a lipid. A nucleotide is a small part of a nucleic acid. Oh, my boxes are getting pretty full. And a triglyceride is a lipid. See, the important thing here is that you know these words because on an exam, I could use them. If I say cholesterol is related to something, you got to know cholesterol is a lipid and everything that goes with that. Only one more comparison is between proteins and nucleic acids. So if lipids and nucleic acids were the most dislike each other, proteins and nucleic acids are probably the most similar. In fact, if you look at the elements that they have in common, it's actually pretty exciting because they have carbon and hydrogen just like you expect of every macromolecule. But they also both contain oxygen and nitrogen. So that's pretty exciting. They have 4 whole elements in common, whereas the other ones have far less. However, each of them does have its own element that is special and important. Phosphorus only belongs to nucleic acids. So if you find something with phosphorus, you know it has to be a nucleic acid and it can't be anything else. Sulfur only belongs to proteins. So if you find something with sulfur, you know it has to be a protein and it can't be anything else. They are both polar. You might notice that polar is in the middle a lot because carbohydrates and nucleic acids and proteins all are polar at least some of the time. But proteins, don't forget, can also be nonpolar because they're special and do all kinds of crazy jobs. Our last 3 should be pretty familiar. Enzymes are always proteins. Amino acids are the small parts of proteins. And nucleotides are the small parts of nucleic acids. So now you should have a sense of how all of these compare. And if you were asked questions about which ones were similar and which ones were different, you'd be able to find out the answers. Thanks.